Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life. And for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. In this episode, we'll be talking to three friends at East Africa Energy Solutions, friends who are creating ways to provide energy to rural Ugandans that is both cheap and sustainable. By helping people to create their own methane gas with low-tech waste processors called biodigesters, they are giving people a clean alternative to charcoal, thus helping Ugandans to save money, live healthier, more productive lives, and in the process, slow the destruction of the country's remaining forests. As part of a generation of young idealists, they are relentlessly hopeful and fiercely committed to the belief that they have the power to change lives and save ecologies.
The idea that something so simple could be turned into something so revolutionary, something so easy could be a solution for so many people, I think is something that people are really excited about. And I know, at least for me, and probably for others too, I get really excited about new ideas and I get excited about innovation.
Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Friends, welcome to this episode of the Earth Keepers podcast. We have a great and interesting episode today. Interesting in that we have three guests with us, all from East Africa Energy Solutions. And I'm going to have the three of you introduce yourselves and tell us just a bit about what you do for this company.
Hey, my name is JJ, and I'm the founder and president of East Africa Energy Solutions.
Hello, my name is Josh Burke, and I'm currently working as the executive director at East Africa Energy Solutions.
Yeah, and my name is Nikki Humphreys, and I am the media and operations manager here.
And I want to talk, of course, about the work that your company does. It's very exciting. But I do also want to talk about you and ask the three of you how you got where you are today in terms of being in this very innovative company that is working for social justice, working for environmental health at the same time. Talk about where you've come from and maybe some of the influences that have shaped you to get to this point.
I think for me, the influences, one is the people back home and the kind of life I grew up watching. I can say maybe I was kind of lucky to kind of sort of have clean energy, but still, my grandfather had a farm and we go back to the farm and we use firewood and charcoal to cook our food. And I saw that either my grandmother or my aunt, inhaling all the smoke and even the people around. That was the order of the day for people to use charcoal. Even in the last 20 years, nothing has changed. Technology is still the same and people still live the same lives. And I think that in the development world, I think there's always better ways to do things. I think that we say we provide alternative ways to clean and sustainable energy. So I think that word alternative means the old methods are not working. So we have to come up with something new that is innovative, user-friendly, that can be sustained locally. That's the heart, and those are my influences.
How about you, Josh? What are the influences that brought you here?
I actually grew up in West Africa. I grew up in Chad, and then I went to boarding school in Cameroon before coming to the U.S. And while my parents were missionaries and Bible translators overseas, my passion for economic development and justice issues really stemmed from the civil war that we went through there. There were a number of different ones, but at a certain point we had been evacuated and we were in the U.S. And just the notion that the people that I knew from the village and my friends and the people that we played soccer with, that they were all stuck there in the village while we had been evacuated and we were home. And while they had to deal with the violence that even when we were in the country during the Civil War, we were in compounds with walls around them and guards, and just the understanding of the difference the world treats a Westerner versus an African in those contexts. When you're there, it's so blatant. When I am a missionary kid and I'm white, they ask me to sit at the front of the church with the elders, even though I'm a little boy and I should be at the back with the others, just because of the economic disparity and the educational disparities that currently exist in our world. And through some classes both in my high school in agricultural development, and then where we all met in the Masters of Global Justice and Development program at Multnomah, just kind of refining those ideas of how do we address some of these inequities, both in the world and also just on a small scale in communities, in the environment and in the economic development.
And Nikki, how about you? What brought you here?
So I was born in China, and then I was adopted when I was 1, and then I grew up in Seattle, Washington. And it wasn't really until undergrad that I kind of started to explore my Chinese American identity. And I start with that because that's really where my passion for ethnic reconciliation and social justice came from. It came from my own experiences of growing up in a predominantly Caucasian neighborhood and then dealing with racist comments, microaggressions, and just overt racism, right? And also understanding that even though I'm in a position of oppression, I'm also in a position of privilege, right? Because I am an Asian American woman. And so, once again, I say all this because in undergrad, I started to realize that it's not just my own ethnic identity. It's not just my own gender identity, sexual identity. It's all these different factors, kind of what JJ was talking about. Nothing ever happens in a bubble. Everything is intersectional. And so when we're addressing issues of racism, we can't ignore the environment. We can't ignore environmental issues and how a lot of people of color are predominantly affected by environment issues. So like when we think about pesticides, when we think about clean air, when we think about clean water, predominantly people of color are the ones affected. And so in order to make a more just and equitable society, I think that we would be remiss to not talk about the environment.
What I'm not hearing is that we have a professional design engineer on the team, right? Or an environmental scientist, but instead you were looking for solutions that were actually accessible to you just in terms of the creation and design of it.
Yeah. Again, it's the idea that the whole idea is to come up with a solution that is very sustainable, that is very accessible, that anyone can use. I mean, we could have looked for an expert, but I think that's not what people need. People need a solution that solves their problem.
I think people need to have modeled to them this idea that you don't need to be a highly trained professional to come up with solutions like this. That if you really believe that you can find the solutions and you know the problem well enough, that you could actually create things that can make a difference without any special credentialing or training.
Speaking to the fact of not being experts, I think anyone who saw us in those initial stages of trying to build that biodigester could easily attest to that. A lot of the time we don't know exactly what we're doing, and we're relying on a lot of Googling and a lot of talking with people that have knowledge. But certainly, like you were saying, I encourage anyone that has, a passion to go for something just to try it and do it and see what happens. And most of the time along the way, you can figure out a lot of stuff.
I really love the emphasis on culture change. And obviously culture change takes time.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that another key element would be relationship, that it takes trust, right? I mean, you can't just go in to a context where people may or may not know you and simply prescribe a solution. They need to believe you. They need to trust you. And relationship, again, it's a lot of work, but in the end, you end up with more sustainable solutions, it sounds like.
Absolutely. I think that without relationships, you'll be you'll be just hanging out by yourself. Some people are so humble to tell you that they don't like you. They'll just tag along. But as soon as you leave, like everything that you did, they'll not carry you on. And that's the sign that there's not enough relationship and trust that was built. And I think that comes at the forefront of everything that we do. Build relationships, and then biodigesters can come in as a result of that relationship. Because that you need to build relationships with leaders, you need relationships with cultural leaders, religious leaders, donors, and everything. So relationships are super key. And again, there's this whole idea of like, hey, we know your problem. We're going to fix your problem. From now on, you suffer no more. And then I think that mentality is, considering the billions of money that has been spent in development work, but we still see a lot of abject poverty in developing countries. I think that there's not been enough investment on the relationship side.
I want to riff on that point in particular, because oftentimes when you talk to people who are focused on issues of community development, human flourishing can sometimes be emphasized almost at the expense of everything else. So, it's all about poverty alleviation. It's all about the provision of healthcare and nutrition. And there isn't a lot of attention given sometimes to this holistic picture that you're talking about, that all of this exists in an environmental context, in an ecology. And what you guys are talking about is actually different. I mean, you're seeing the environment is almost like a stakeholder in the whole thing, right? The ecology is actually a player in the solution and even in the culture that you're talking about. I'm wondering if you can comment on where that came from, that balancing toward creation as an element of human flourishing.
Like for me, I grew up in Uganda, and my grandfather was a farmer. He had a big farm, a dairy farm. He has cows. And growing up, and then when I look back, everything that human flourishing or money or whatever depended on the environment. If we didn't get enough rains, there will not be enough pasture. There will not be enough water for the cows. There will not be enough rain for the crops. So whatever you call human flourishing without taking that into an account, I think it's a mismanagement, and you're missing a big point. But also it comes to the effects, like what we're seeing. The research shows that in the last 25 years, Uganda has lost about 63% of its forest cover. And now we're seeing floods every year. We're seeing prolonged droughts. The rains don't come back at the time when they used to come back. There's less food that is being grown. So all these effects that connect back to the environment, especially in a developing country where the weather and weather patterns are very, very important for people, for human flourishing. Actually, that's like the main thing. Some people, if it doesn't rain in America, people still have food. They'll go to the store and buy food. And in some places around the world, if it doesn't rain, that is a catastrophe. There's not enough food. Their cows don't have enough grass. They don't have enough water because they have to go to the wells to fetch water. So all the human flourishing actually in the developing world is directly tied to the environment. So the better the environment, the better the other aspects.
Nikki, I'm actually really interested in something you said earlier, just about the disproportionate impact of environmental damage and degradation on people of color. And it's certainly true in the US. And that seems to me to be an element of this same question about holistic development, about looking at human flourishing, but understanding that it's part of this bigger matrix of factors that exist within an ecology. I'm wondering, what's been your experience of that, and how do you see the holistic question as it applies here in the US?
In terms of human flourishing, we have to think about, even if some of us are flourishing, not all of us are flourishing, right? And so what does it mean for me to be okay, but for other people not to be? And am I okay with that? Am I okay benefiting from a system in which I'm okay, but other people are being negatively affected, right? I think about farms that use GMOs and pesticides that get into our water and negatively affect the drinking water that people are drinking in. I think about chemicals and pollutants that are entering the air through factories, and how a lot of communities of color are disproportionately in areas in which the air quality is bad. Like, what does that mean for me who lives in a region with good air quality and good water? What does that mean for me to be okay with other people being negatively affected? So I think that's something that we have to look at, and that's something that, once again, it's a justice issue, right? It can't just We can't just look at anything in a bubble. So
Right.
like when I think about my own privilege as being an Asian American woman and my own oppression as being an Asian American woman, I also have to add in that factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What about you, Josh? Given the context where you grew up, what did you see in terms of or the balance or the imbalance between human flourishing and taking the environment into account as part of that?
Yeah, where I grew up was in Chad, and it was in the Sahel, which is right in the belt right below the Sahara. It goes across kind of Central Africa. And my village, it was basically in the desert. The south of Chad is grassland, but where we were at in the heat of the summer, it would get up to 120 degrees and cool down to maybe 80 at night. And the people of the village would talk about their grandparents having seen antelope in the fields and there being green pasture throughout the year. But when I was there was green pasture for about 2 to 3 months of the year when it was raining constantly. And then it would dry up and the rains would go away and you would only have dirt and dry grass. And, just where I went down to high school was down in Cameroon, and there they have 3 growing seasons. And just the disproportion, just like Nikki was talking about with water, like we don't think about that. But in Cameroon, we would go to villages and we'd talk about development in one of my agricultural development classes. And they'd say, we don't need agricultural development. It's like at some point, the fields will get small enough that will be important. But right now, we suffer nothing in terms of food. I mean, they have plenty of other things, but there are banana trees growing everywhere. You can't even buy bananas. You can't buy papayas because they're everywhere and no one cares about them because there's so much food around. And just the stark contrast of those two is incredible. One thing I do want to say when it comes to this topic that I think isn't brought up enough is that, it does affect the environmental flourishing, does affect human flourishing, and they can't be separated from each other. But I think there can also be a double standard here from where the West holds Africa to where they never held themselves to. And we had the Industrial Revolution where the West took off using coal and using dirty energy. And now when Africa needs an industrial revolution of its own, we're asking it to being held to a standard where green energy right now is more expensive. And we're working on alternatives. That's part of what we do as well. But we can't hold other countries that are in a later stage of development to a standard that we didn't necessarily hold ourselves. So I'd call for some people that really care about the environment to be careful on how they speak into the African narrative, because while they might be seeing an emphasis of the environment, Africa is feeling the environmental change, but they're also feeling that if they don't gain some economic power, that they can be pushed around by the bigger people like the US, that we get the ability to push people around in the UN and everything. And Africa often ends up on the receiving end of that. And we get to preach to them, even though that we used all of that dirty power to get to where we currently are and are trying to transition right now.
Some of my students, I teach community development as well, and some of my African students are of the opinion that Africa actually has a lot to say to the world, especially in terms of how to live better with the environment, how to live in relationship to the environment in a way that just is a little bit alien to a more Western mindset. I'm wondering, would you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, people have lived in these countries, on these places since creation. So they definitely know how to take care of the environment. They use local knowledge. They use the knowledge of their great grandfathers, and the fact that they're still alive, I mean, they've taken care of the environment. So they definitely have some knowledge to share. I think it takes humility, it takes intentionality to actually know how to take care of that environment.
That's actually a really nice segue to talking more about East Africa Energy Solutions. I'm really curious about what you do. You've obliquely referred to the biodigester. So maybe tell us about that first of all. But I think that there's this bigger vision that exists around this one mechanism. And so I'm curious to hear about that as well. But maybe give us the layperson's view of what this thing does and what it provides for people.
The simplest way to put it is that it takes organic matter like manure or compost and turns that into a cooking gas and a high quality manure or fertilizer. if you're adding manure in the front, it is still a mix of manure and water, but it is neutralized in the process of digestion as it reaches in excess of 150 degrees inside the tank. And so it actually comes out purified as well, but it's excellent for the crop.
So, Nikki, you have the challenge of convincing people to fund something that is essentially based around manure. I'm wondering, how do you encounter that challenge?
The idea that something so simple could be turned into something so revolutionary, something so easy could be a solution for so many people, I think is something that people are really excited about. And I know, at least for me and probably for others too, I get really excited about new ideas and I get excited about innovation. And I think that's really what JJ and Josh are bringing at East Africa Energy Solutions.
Yes, I completely agree. Friends, we're going to pause for a couple minutes so we can hear a message from our executive producer, James, and his son, Teddy. So we'll be right back.
Hello, everyone. This is James Amadon. I'm the executive director of Circlewood, the organization behind the Earthkeepers podcast. I'm also the executive producer and occasional co-host of the podcast with Forrest. I'm here with my son, Teddy, to talk for a moment about the podcast.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing great. My dad helped start this podcast in March, and sometimes he records it from our house. He told me there are people who are listening in 32 countries and 6 continents. Wow!
Yes, wow indeed. We are grateful for every single one of you who have been listening. We've really enjoyed putting together our first inaugural season, and we're excited to launch Season 2 in January. We're happy to offer the podcast to everyone free of charge, but unfortunately, it's not free to make. If you find yourself, like so many these days, struggling economically because of the pandemic, we are praying for you, and just know that our only hope is that you continue to listen and be encouraged. If, however, the podcast has blessed you and you find yourself with some financial flexibility, would you consider a year-end gift to help support the show? It's really easy to send a one-time gift or to sign up as a monthly giver. You just have to visit our website at www.circlewood.online/podcast. There you'll find a clear link to our secure online giving portal. Whether you're able to give $5 or $500, every gift will help. And becoming a partner with us will ensure that we can continue to create the kind of episodes that explore the work of creative earthkeepers from around the globe. Episodes that empowers listeners just like you in your own work of earthkeeping, and help all of us make the world a better place for those of the next generation, like Teddy.
Thank you for listening to Earthkeepers and for all the ways you help take care of the earth.
Thanks indeed.
Happy holidays!
I'm guessing that people listening to you describe this technology, most people are probably thinking, oh, that's so great for Africa. But why wouldn't they think about it for here? I mean, have you actually talked to people about using systems in the States?
Well, actually, out in Tillamook, down here in Oregon, they have massive biodigesters, and they're using them primarily for the fertilizer coming out of them. But yeah, we have broached the conversation, and JJ's talked with a number of people that support us that have actually been interested in building some of them as well, as they're great for a backyard barbecue or something like that.
Why not?
And there are companies that focus specifically on it, that, we all have compost. Why give it to the city to take it to somewhere we don't really know? And there are plenty of things that we can do to enrich our own yard.
So taking the kind of macro view of your work, what are some of the values that inform what you do and how you do it? What's important?
I think what is really important is that, specifically for this, is that the old methods are not working, especially for East Africa or Africa in general. I'll speak for Uganda and East Africa because that's where I'm familiar. So that I think that the human race is being blessed by the ability to invent. If things are not working, we have the ability to make changes. And I think for for the last 400 plus years, East Africa has not really made strides to invent in terms of cooking. Like our great grandfathers used firewood and charcoal to cook their food. And I think that might have been the right thing to do 200 years ago, with that population. Probably we had more trees than the people, but I think now we're almost having more people, more human activities that are taking away forest cover and trees. So realistically, we can't depend on firewood as our main source of cooking. And I think that drives us with the questions like, okay, what now? If that is not the way to go. I think that, to me, we have the capacity to do that. We just need to find that solution. And the biodigester is one of the basic things that could really come and revolutionize that. As Nikki said, even the poorest person in East Africa has some sort of compost. As long as people eat, there's always going to be some compost and some garden weeds and all that. If you drive, I know you've been to Kampala, some places, you drive to some places, actually, it's really nasty because people throw food on the street. I think that also affects the environment. So the idea is to do some innovation and help people. Hey, there's another way that you can do life. And actually, it's not that bad. It just needs a little bit of work to prepare, hopefully to lay the ground for the future. Because the future plans, or the main goal, is to be able to build a biodigester plant, a big one where you can run power lines going to people's homes instead of building individual ones. But now for the start is like, hey, we can go micro, like you asked. We can go micro, build one for a family of 8, a family of 7, until we reach to that level where we have the ability to build a bigger biodigester plant to feed the whole community at once.
The first thought I had when I went to your website and looked at the biodigester and began to read about the rationale, the very first memory or image I had as I was thinking about that was time I spent in El Salvador, living in a village and sleeping actually in, a typical home there. And they had electricity, but very limited, and did all their cooking, of course, with wood and charcoal. For me, I have migraines that are triggered by particulates and wood smoke in particular. So it was not a fun time for me.
Yeah.
But I was thinking that there must be many people who are really impacted by the same sort of issue. So just on a health issue alone, this has got to be revolutionary.
Absolutely. I think that you've said it right. There's lots of people who are complaining about eyes and headaches, and there's a growing rate of people with respiratory illnesses. It's not because they smoke, but they inhale all the smoke from cooking. They have to cook inside, especially if it rains, as they have to cook dinners. So they move the kitchen inside the house, and with no proper ventilation and all that, it's just not healthy at all.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate what you're saying about the impact that goes so far beyond the sort of simple introduction of a technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about my friends in Kenya who work with water projects, specifically installing big water tanks to collect the rain. And for many of the same reasons, it has changed the lives of women in particular, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're the ones who have to haul the water, spend so much time, and suddenly they have more time to invest, not just in their children and funding their education, but creating community initiatives and creating businesses together. And it's just amazing the transformation that happened. And it sounds like this is the same sort of technology, just a really simple step, a really simple introduction has such a sort of disproportionately huge effect on the culture, on the society of a place.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. The thing is it equalizes the society, because for some people, charcoal is actually for the privileged, that they can actually afford to buy charcoal. So you're eliminating classism in the process. Like everyone has everyone has a biodigester in the community. So it just, especially women. Okay, women don't have to go now to fetch firewood. They'll spend more time maybe making baskets, maybe growing more food for sale, but they also save money on energy. A bag of charcoal is about $40 a month for someone in a small town, and that's a lot of money for an average East African. And depending on how many people live in your family, even that bag of charcoal can go for 2 to 3 weeks. So you're looking at $50 a month just on charcoal. And to some people, that is a real stretch. And I think a biodigester just saves people a lot of money as well.
So we're going to link to all of these things on the website, and we'll certainly put your website on our website. And so anyone listening to this podcast can follow the links to learn more about this. But I know that you are doing a fundraising campaign in this month of December. And I wonder, Nikki, if you could tell us more about that, and if people are excited by this idea, how they could actually support it, become part of this change that you all are trying to make.
The December campaign is all about building a sustainability center in Uganda. So by the time this is airing, we will have purchased land. We're partnering with some local people and getting land in Uganda, about 2 hours out of the city. And from there, we are planning to build a sustainability center, which will be used to package and process foods, crops that we're growing, as well as store and manufacture materials for the biodigester and create biodigesters there. And finally, we're also planning to educate and hold classes for local farmers on how to market and sell products. And to really build community and relationship and trust.
We have a Christmas store that we've launched as well. We recycled pallets from around the Portland area. We brought them down into planks, and we made mug holders that go along the walls out of those pallets. So you can check those out. Those are also on our website under the store side of things. And Nikki designed and has printed a number of really incredible Christmas cards that are unique to us. And so we'd encourage you, if you're going to send out some Christmas updates to people or give your wishes, to do it through those.
Yeah, hopefully people will have heard about this before they're hearing the podcast. So we'll definitely promote that. But then there are some who practice the 12 days of Christmas. So they've still got plenty of time, right, to use your Christmas store. So absolutely, I'm super intrigued by that. That's great. Well, you, Nikki, mentioned your youth and you kind of downplayed it. But, there a lot of our guests, especially the older experienced guests, they end up saying that when I ask them about their hope, what is their hope about, the environment and creation care in times when it's so easy to despair? And so many of them actually point to you all, to your generation, and they will say that the hope lies in the creative impulse that's coming from younger generations, that's coming from the hope that comes from your capacity really to not be so daunted by limits and limitations, that there's more of a tendency to think that anything's possible, right? And a willingness, I think, too, to start small, to start grassroots. You're seeing it really on this more relational level, yep, and this more co-equal level where you're partnering with people that you want to serve rather than taking a top-down expert approach. So I'm wondering if you think that's true, if there is actually a lot of this energy that is in the generation that you represent, and how do you see that equation in terms of people who are seeing their hope for the world in you?
Totally. Yeah. I think it's funny, this question, just because I am actually kind of known for being a cynic, and I'm known for being negative and a Debbie Downer sometimes. But I think that's partly why I can't speak into the subject a little bit. It's really easy for me to feel like there's no hope and that, things that we're doing are futile. But I think in order for me to keep living, like kind of what you talked about, the relationship, when I look to see change, when I see the most change, it's in relationships. When I think about like social justice issues and like ethnic reconciliation, I see the most change in people when I build relationships and when I get to know them. Because when it comes down to it, relationships and love move people. They move people to do crazy, wild things, right? And so I think kind of what you're talking about of small grassroots relational movements, that's really where it's at. Because I think for me and for a lot of other people, we've seen systems fail us. We've seen large entities not really represent us well and not necessarily give us the chance to voice our opinions and to be heard. And so I think, once again, in that relational aspect, it gives chance for dialogue. It gives chance for equal exchange. It gives, once again, people a sense of agency, a sense that they are in control a little bit with their futures, right? Learning from from people of the past, from movements of the past, it's a slow growing thing, but I think little by little, we can genuinely make change.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Josh, I'm wondering, what's your take on this? If you were to give advice to folks of your age who maybe are feeling a bit hopeless, or at least feeling disempowered to the point where they don't think they can make a difference, what kind of advice would you give them? Where do they find hope?
Yeah, I think it's so easy when you look, especially in 2020, but I think every generation feels that. Every generation has their challenges. And I think just looking, back, one generation, if you look like maybe in the last 5 years, you can be more depressed. You look at the work you need to do ahead. But if you go back, you can see progressively, you can see change. Like just even the fact, like for our generation right now, which I don't think it's a generational thing. Maybe it's more just being young. And that's what it's like to, think that you can change the world and you need some of that naivete. But like, just for our generation, like if I talk to someone that's older and I know I'm going to be talking about sustainability, I'm like, oh boy, here comes the argument. But when I talk to someone more in our age bracket, with a number of exceptions, the idea of sustainability isn't something that's radical. It's something that they're like, oh yeah, we want to see that happen too. And so maybe it'll be our kids or our kids' kids that make the next changes. But I think if every generation just looks forward to making, one more change, or you personally look forward to just make a significant improvement just in your life from wherever you started, just make sure that by the time you end your life on this world, that you've just, made one little step forward in your community. And I think if we all have that mindset, that big things can happen.
Well, I think it's significant that this is the last episode of the 2020 season for Earthkeepers podcast. Significant because you all are pushing back on the idea that this was the worst year, good riddance. Let's move on. There is an element of truth to that, but I think your perspectives are different. You're saying it's not only bad, that we've got to find hope, to understand that, in fact, some good stuff has happened, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, comment on that a little bit. Like, what do you have to say to 2020 as we say goodbye?
So I think that we don't say that being negligent, that there's actual suffering. People have lost lives. People have lost homes with the wildfires in Portland and California. People have lost jobs. Depression's on the rise, and all those things that are happening. But I still think there's a lot of good things that are happening. I think it takes a bit of work. There's definitely more work, and finding people working from home, having to adjust, creating an office while having little kids running around, people having to do Zoom, people having to do all this. These are all stress levels, but the thing is people don't have to commute. People are spending more time with their loved ones more than they did. I think it's also good for the environment. How many cars in the morning were all lined up on the highway going to work, all the fumes and all that. So I think 2020 is hard, but it's probably not the worst. And I think that as an optimist, I think that there's still hope, and there's a lot of good things that are happening in 2020.
Josh, any parting words for 2020?
Well, perhaps I'm not quite as optimistic as JJ, but I do think that, people say some of the phrases that I've heard over the course of this year, the nation's more divided than it ever has been, or, the numbers of people dying and stuff like that. And without to minimize the issues that we're dealing with, this definitely isn't the worst. that the nation has ever been divided. We had a civil war, and it isn't the most tense racial time. Like, there have been steps that have been made, and there need to be more important steps made. But to say that, this year is the ultimate of all those things just isn't true. Like JJ was saying, like every generation, every year, some more than others definitely are going to have their challenges and confrontations, but I don't think that extremist kind of thinking lends itself towards actual progress. It just lends itself to giving up.
Yeah, good point. What about you, Nikki? Any last words for 2020?
Yeah, to echo what JJ and Josh were saying, I think this is just a pivotal year for us. And I think even though there were plenty of hardships, I am still optimistic and hopeful for the future, because I know that out of this hardship, good things will happen. I know that, we are resilient people. And even though the situations are not ideal, I know that people are innovative, and I know that amazing things will come out of it because people are amazing.
Yeah, and crisis sometimes calls us to be our better selves. Yeah.
Yep.
We've been in conversation with JJ, Nikki, and Josh, the innovators behind East Africa Energy Solutions. To find out how you can support the work of EAES, go to eastafricaenergysolutions.org or go to the show notes for this episode on our podcast website. Earthkeepers Podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. We invite you to become a financial supporter of Earthkeepers. Please visit our website at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers to make a donation that will help expand the reach and frequency of this production. It also helps us immensely when you leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And please share this podcast with anyone you know who seeks to become an agent of change and advocacy for the good of the earth. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. I'm Forrest Tinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers Podcast.